Alrighty. I think we are all set. Huh, helps if I do that. There we go. Alrighty. Okay. Good morning, good morning, good morning. And welcome back, I hope, to Storytime Saturdays, formerly Freeform Fridays, but now it's Storytime Saturdays because of scheduling constraints. All right, so today our goal, of course, is to get through the last three stories in Greg Egan's Axiomatic. We've been through some ups and downs in this book. A lot of kind of bittersweet endings, or at least mostly, some fairly dark stuff. We've got a dark, I hesitate to call it a comedy, coming up in The Moral Virologist, or Virologist, however that's supposed to be pronounced. We also have Closer, which is mostly a downer because it's about the unexpected consequences of getting much, much, much closer to a partner. It is the return of the Ndoli device, or the Jewel. Um, so we get to hear more about the trials and travails of civilization after that has been invented. And then, what's the name of the last one? I do not remember the name of the last one. Name of the last one is Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies, which is it's a really interesting one about gosh, you'll see. But it's kind of, uh, ideologies and what people believe. And in this case, it's and how that can tend to be dictated geographically. In this case, that taken to the most literal possible extent. So of these, I think the longest is either The Moral Virologist or Closer. Um, they're not super long, but this one is probably going to run over 2 hours. But that's fine. We like that. We like that. After this week, I will be going ahead and doing more just general pulpy fare. If people have suggestions or things they want read aloud, do not hesitate to post something in chat, and I will take note of it, and I will get it in there, and I will try and make it happen. Uh, Preferably things that don't have too many diagrams, because that's not as easy to show or describe or represent, as I have found much to my chagrin. I was wholeheartedly going to read some other of Greg Egan's works, but they tend to be fairly diagram heavy. Even if they're like, really simplistic diagrams, like barely even line graphs in many cases, or depictions of sine waves, it's not. You can't really read that out loud, honestly. You have to show an image, and I have not advanced to a point in skill in which I can show that stuff on the fly yet. Perhaps later. Other books I would have loved to have read, but due to the visual nature of the way it was formatted, kind of made it tough, was some stuff by Ian M. Banks. If you have not read any of the culture novels by Ian M. Banks, you should get on that. They're really good. I wanted to read Accession because that book is crazy and stands on its own very well. But it's got some segments that are they're formatted in a very specific way, and without me explaining what's going on, it's not, and that kind of kills the joke, and it kills the jokes that are in there, and kills kind of like a bunch of the suspense. It's sort of spoilery once you understand what's going on sometimes. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to get a quick swig of fluid in my mouth once I learn how to open a container. And once my cat gets out of the way, come on. Come on, cat. He's wondering why I'm doing this and and not, giving him belly rubs or whatever. Or head pettings or chin squitches. He has demands. Alrighty, here we go. I'm influidated. Sorry about that. And without further ado, The Moral Virologist by Greg Egan. Out on the street, in the dazzling sunshine of a warm Atlanta morning, a dozen young children were playing, chasing, wrestling, and hugging each other, laughing and yelling, crazy and jubilant for no other reason than being alive on such a day. Inside the gleaming white building, though, behind the double-glazed windows, the air was slightly chilly, the way John Shawcross preferred it, and nothing could be heard but the air conditioning and a faint electrical hum. The schematic of the protein molecule trembled very slightly. Shawcross grinned, already certain of success. As the pH displayed in the screen's top left crossed the critical value, the point at which, according to his calculations, the energy of conformation B should drop below that of conformation A, the protein suddenly convulsed and turned completely inside out. It was exactly as he had predicted, and his binding studies had added strong support, but to see the transformation, however complex the algorithms that had led from reality to screen, was naturally the most satisfying proof. He replayed the event, backward and forward, several times, utterly captivated. This marvelous device would easily be worth the 800,000 he'd paid for it. The salesperson had provided several impressive demonstrations, of course, but this was the first time Shawcross had used the machine for his own work. Images of proteins in solution. Normal X-ray diffraction could only work with crystalline samples, in which a molecule's configuration often bore little resemblance to its aqueous, biologically relevant form. An ultrasonically stimulated semi-ordered liquid phase was the key, not to mention some major breakthroughs in computing. Shawcross couldn't follow all the details, but that was no impediment to using the machine. He charitably wished upon the inventor Nobel Prizes in chemistry, physics, and medicine, viewed the stunning results of his experiment once again, then stretched, rose to his feet, and went out in search of lunch. On his way to the delicatessen, he passed that bookshop, as always. A lurid new poster in the window caught his eye, a naked young man stretched out on a bed in a state of post-coital languor, one corner of the sheet only just concealing his groin. Emblazoned across the top of the poster, in imitation of a glowing red neon sign, was the book's title, A Hot Night's Safe Sex. Shawcross shook his head in anger and disbelief. What was wrong with people? Hadn't they read his advertisement? Were they blind, stupid, arrogant? Safety lay only in the obedience of God's laws. After eating, he called in at a newsagent that carried several foreign papers. The previous Saturday's editions had arrived, and his advertisement was in all of them, where necessary, translated into the appropriate languages. Half a page in a major newspaper was not cheap anywhere in the world, but then money had never been a problem.
"Adulterers! Sodomites! Repent and be saved! Abandon your wickedness now, or die and burn forever!"
He couldn't have put it more plainly, could he? Nobody could claim that they hadn't been warned. In 1981, Matthew Shawcross bought a tiny, run-down cable TV station in the Bible Belt, which until then had split its airtime between scratchy black and white film clips of 50s gospel singers and local novelty acts such as snake handlers, protected by their faith, not to mention the removal of their pets' venom glands, and epileptic children, encouraged by their parents' prayers and a carefully timed withdrawal of medication to let the Spirit move them. Matthew Shawcross dragged the station into the 1980s, spending a fortune on a 30-second computer-animated station ID, a fleet of pirouetting, crenellated spaceships firing crucifix-shaped missiles into a relief map of the USA, chiseling out the station logo of Liberty, holding up not a torch, but a cross, showing the latest, slickest gospel rock video clips, Christian soap operas, and Christian game shows, and, above all, identifying issues communism, depravity, godlessness in schools, which could serve as the themes for telethons to raise funds to expand the station, so that future telethons might be even more successful. 10 years later, he owned one of the country's biggest cable TV networks. John Shawcross was at college, on the verge of taking up paleontology, when AIDS first began to make the news in a big way. As the epidemic snowballed, and the spiritual celebrities he most admired, his father included, began proclaiming it the to be the dis- began proclaiming the disease to be God's will, he found himself increasingly obsessed by it. In an age where the word miracle belonged to medicine and science, here was a plague, straight out of the Old Testament, destroying the wicked and sparing the righteous, give or take some hemophiliacs and transfusion recipients, proving to Shawcross beyond any doubt that sinners could be punished in this life as well as in the next. This was, he decided, valuable in at least two ways. Not only would sinners to whom damnation had seemed a remote and unproven threat now have a powerful worldly reason to reform, but the righteous would be strengthened in their resolve by this unarguable sign of heavenly support and approval. In short, the mere existence of AIDS made John Shawcross feel good, and he gradually became convinced that some kind of personal involvement with HIV, the AIDS virus, would make him feel even better. He lay awake at night, pondering God's mysterious ways, and wondering how he could get in on the act. AIDS research would be aimed at a cure, so how could he possibly justify involving himself with that? Then, in the early hours of one cold morning, he was woken by sounds from the room next to his giggling, grunting, and the squeaking of bed springs. He wrapped his pillow around his ears and tried to go back to sleep, but the sounds could not be ignored, nor could the effect they wrought on his own fallible flesh. He masturbated for a while, on the pretext of trying to manually crush his unwanted erection, but stopped short of orgasm and lay, shivering, in a state of heightened moral perception. It was a different woman every week he'd seen them leaving in the morning. He'd tried to counsel his fellow student, but had been mocked for his troubles. Shawcross didn't blame the poor young man. Was it any wonder people laughed at the truth when every movie, every book, every magazine, every rock song still sanctioned promiscuity and perversion, making them out to be normal and good? The fear of AIDS might have saved millions of sinners, but millions more still ignored it, absurdly convinced that their chosen partners could never be infected, or trusting in condoms to frustrate the will of God. The trouble was, vast segments of the population had, in spite of their wantonness, remained uninfected, and the use of condoms, according to the studies he'd read, did seem to reduce the risk of transmission. These facts disturbed Shawcross a great deal. Why would an omnipotent God create an imperfect tool? Was it a matter of divine mercy? That was possible, he conceded, but it struck him as rather distasteful. Sexual Russian roulette was hardly a fitting image of the Lord's capacity for forgiveness. Or, Shawcross tingled all over as the possibility crystallized in his brain, might AIDS be no more than a mere prophetic shadow, hinting at a future plague 1,000 times more terrible? A warning to the wicked to change their ways while they still had time? An example to the righteous as to how they might do his will? Shawcross broke into a sweat. The sinners next door moaned as if already in hell. The thin dividing wall vibrated. The wind rose up to shake the dark trees and rattle his window. What was this wild idea in his head? A true message from God, or the product of his own imperfect understanding? He needed guidance. He switched on his reading lamp and picked up his Bible from the bedside table. With his eyes closed, he opened the book at random. He recognized the passage at the very first glance. He ought to have. He'd read it and reread it 100 times, and knew it almost by heart. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. At first, he tried to deny his destiny. He was unworthy, a sinner himself, an ignorant child. But everyone was unworthy. Everyone was a sinner. Everyone was an ignorant child in God's eyes. It was pride, not humility, that spoke against God's choice of him. By morning, not a trace of doubt remained. Dropping paleontology was a great relief. Defending creationism with any conviction required a certain very special way of thinking, and he had never been quite sure that he could master it. Biochemistry, on the other hand, he mastered with ease. Confirmation, if any was needed, that he'd made the right decision. He topped his classes every year and went on to do a PhD in molecular biology at Harvard, then postdoctoral work at the NIH, and fellowships in Canada and France. He lived for his work, pushing himself mercilessly, but always taking care not to be too conspicuous in his achievements. He published very little, usually as a modest third or fourth co-author, and when at last he flew home from France, nobody in his field knew, or would have much cared, that John Shawcross had returned, ready to begin his real work. Shawcross worked alone in the gleaming white building that served as both laboratory and home. He couldn't risk taking on employees, no matter how closely their beliefs might have matched his own. He hadn't even let his parents in on the secret. He told them he was engaged in theoretical molecular genetics, which was a lie of omission only, and he had no need to beg his father for money week by week, since, for tax reasons, 25% of the Shawcross Empire's massive profit was routinely paid into his accounts in his name. His lab was filled with shiny gray boxes, from which ribbon cables snaked to PCs, the latest generation fully automated synthesizers and sequencers of DNA, RNA, and proteins, all available off the shelf to anyone with the money to buy them. Half a dozen robot arms did all the grunt work, pipetting and diluting reagents, labeling tubes, loading and unloading centrifuges. At first, Shawcross spent most of his time working with computers, searching databases for the sequence and structure information that would provide him with starting points, later buying time on a supercomputer to predict the shapes and interactions of molecules as yet unknown. When aqueous X-ray diffraction became possible, his work sped up by a factor of 10. To synthesize and observe the actual proteins and nucleic acids was now both faster and more reliable than the hideously complex process, even with the best shortcuts, approximations, and tricks, of solving Schrodinger's equation for molecule. Ugh, oh my goodness, I cannot talk today. To synthesize and observe the actual proteins and nucleic acids was now both faster and more reliable than the hideously complex process of solving Schrödinger's equation for a molecule consisting of hundreds of thousands of atoms. Base by base, gene by gene, the Shawcross virus grew. As the woman removed the last of her clothes, Shawcross, sitting naked on the motel room's plastic bucket chair, said, "You must have had sexual intercourse with hundreds of men." "Thousands. Don't you want to come closer, honey? Can you see okay from there?"
I can see fine.
She lay back, still for a moment, with her hands cupping her breasts. Then she closed her eyes and began to slide her palms across her torso. This was the 200th occasion on which Shawcross had paid a woman to tempt him. When he had begun the desensitizing process 5 years before, he had found it almost unbearable. Tonight, he knew he would sit calmly and watch the woman achieve, or skillfully imitate, orgasm, without experiencing even a flicker of lust himself.
You take precautions, I suppose.
She smiled, but kept her eyes closed.
Damn right I do. If a man won't wear a condom, he can take his business elsewhere. And I put it on. He doesn't do it himself. When I put it on, it stays on. Why? Have you changed your mind?
No, just curious. Shawcross always paid in full, in advance, for the act he did not perform, and always explained to the woman very clearly at the start that at any time he might weaken, he might make the decision to rise from the chair and join her. No mere circumstantial impediment could take any credit for his inaction. Nothing but his own free will stood between him and mortal sin. Tonight he wondered why he continued. The temptation had become a formal ritual, with no doubt whatsoever as to the outcome. No doubt? Surely that was pride speaking, his wiliest and most persistent enemy. Every man and woman forever trod the edge of a precipice over the inferno, at risk more than ever of falling to those hungry flames when he or she least believed it possible. Shawcross stood and walked over to the woman. Without hesitation, he placed one hand on her ankle. She opened her eyes and sat up, regarding him with amusement, then took hold of his wrist and began to drag his hand along her leg, pressing it hard against the warm, smooth skin. Just above the knee, he began to panic, but it wasn't until his fingers struck moisture that he pulled free with a strangled mewling sound and staggered back to the chair, breathless and shaking. That was more like it. The Shawcross virus was to be a masterful piece of biological clockwork, the likes of which William Paley could never have imagined, and which no godless evolutionist would dare to attribute to the blind watchmaker of chance. Its single strand of RNA would describe not one, but four potential organisms. Shawcross virus A, SVA, the anonymous form, would be highly infectious, but utterly benign. It would reproduce within a variety of host cells in the skin and mucous membranes, without causing the least disruption to normal cellular functions. Its protein coat had been designed so that every exposed site mimicked some portion of a naturally occurring human protein. The immune system, being necessarily blind to these substances, to avoid attacking the body itself, would be equally blind to the invader. Small numbers of SVA would make their way into the bloodstream, infecting T lymphocytes and triggering stage 2 of the virus's genetic program. A system of enzymes would make RNA copies of hundreds of genes from every chromosome of the host's cell DNA, and these copies would then be incorporated into the virus itself. So, the next generation of the virus would carry with it, in effect, a genetic fingerprint of the host in which it had come into being. Shawcross called this second form SVC, the C standing for customized, since every individual's unique genetic profile would give rise to a unique strain of SVC, or celibate, because in a celibate person only SVA and SVC would be present. SVC would be able to survive only in blood, semen, and vaginal fluids. Like SVA, it would be immunologically invisible, but with an added twist. Its choice of camouflage would vary wildly from person to person, so that even if its disguise was imperfect, and antibodies to a dozen, or 100, or 1,000 particular strains could be produced, universal vaccination would remain impossible.
Like SVA, it would not alter the function of its hosts, with one minor exception. When infecting cells in the vaginal mucous membrane, the prostate, or the seminiferous epithelium, it would cause the manufacture and secretion of these cells of several dozen enzymes specifically designed to degrade varieties of rubber. The holes created by a brief exposure would be invisibly small, but from a viral point of view, they'd be enormous. Upon reinfecting T cells, SVC would be capable of making an informed decision as to what the next generation would be. Like SVA, it would create a genetic fingerprint of its host cell. It would then compare this with its stored ancestral copy. If the two fingerprints were identical, proving that the customized strain had remained within the body in which it had begun, its daughters would be simply more SVC. However, if the fingerprints failed to match, implying that the strain had now crossed into another person's body, and if gender-specific markers showed that the two hosts were not of the same sex, the daughter virus would be a third variety, SVM, containing both fingerprints. The M stood for monogamous or marriage certificate. Shawcross, a great romantic, found it almost unbearably sweet to think of two people's love for each other being expressed in this way, deep down at the subcellular level, and of man and wife, by the very act of making love, signing a contract of faithfulness until death, literally in their own blood. SVM would be, externally, much like SVC. Of course, when it infected a T cell, it would check the host's fingerprint against both stored copies, and if either one matched, it all would be well, and more SVM would continue to be produced. Shawcross called the fourth form of the virus SVD. It could arise in two ways: from SVC directly, when the gender markers implied that a homosexual act had taken place, or from SVM, when the detection of a third genetic fingerprint suggested that the molecular marriage contract had been violated. SVD forced its host cells to secrete enzymes that catalyzed the disintegration of vital structural proteins in the blood vessel walls. Sufferers from an SVD infection would undergo massive hemorrhaging all over their body. Shawcross had found that mice died within 2 or 3 minutes of an injection of pre-infected lymphocytes, and rabbits within 5 or 6 minutes. The timing varied slightly depending on the choice of injection site. SVD was designed so that its protein coat would degrade in air or in solutions outside a narrow range of temperature and pH, and its RNA alone was non-infectious. Catching SVD from a dying victim would be almost impossible. Because of the swiftness of death, an adulterer would have no time to infect their innocent spouse. The widow or widower would, of course, be sentenced to celibacy for the rest of their life, but Shawcross did not think this too harsh. It took two people to make a marriage, he reasoned, and some small share of the blame could always be apportioned to the other partner. Even assuming that the virus fulfilled its design goals precisely, Shawcross acknowledged a number of complications. Blood transfusions would become impractical until a foolproof method of killing the virus in vitro was found. 5 years ago, this would have been tragic, but Shawcross was encouraged by the latest work in synthetic and cultured blood components, and had no doubt that his epidemic would cause more funds and manpower to be diverted into the area. Transplants were less easily dealt with, but Shawcross thought them somewhat frivolous anyway, an expensive and rarely justifiable use of scarce resources. Doctors, nurses, dentists, paramedics, police, undertakers, well, in fact, everyone, would have to take extreme precautions to avoid exposure to other people's blood. Shawcross was impressed, though of course not surprised, at God's foresight here. The rarer and less deadly AIDS virus had gone before, encouraging practices verging on the paranoid in dozens of professions, multiplying rubber glove sales by orders of magnitude. Now the overkill would all be justified, since everyone would be infected with, at the very least, SVC. Rape of virgin by virgin would become a sort of biological shotgun wedding. Any other kind would be murder and suicide. The death of the victim would be tragic, of course, but the near certain death of the rapist would surely be an overwhelming deterrent. Shawcross decided that the crime would virtually disappear. Homosexual incest between identical twins would escape punishment, since the virus could have no way of telling one from the other. This omission irritated Shawcross, especially since he was unable to find any published statistics that would allow him to judge the prevalence of such abominable behavior. In the end, he decided that this minor flaw would constitute a necessary token remnant, a kind of moral fossil of man's inalienable potential to consciously choose evil. It was in the northern summer of 2000 that the virus was completed and tested as well as it could be in tissue culture experiments and on laboratory animals. Apart from establishing the fatality of SVD, created by test tube simulations of human sins of the flesh, rats, mice, and rabbits were of little value because so much of the virus's behavior was tied up in its interaction with the human genome. In cultured human cell lines, though, the clockwork all seemed to unwind exactly as far and never further than appropriate to the circumstances. Generation after generation of SVA, SVC, and SVM remained stable and benign. Of course, more experiments could have been done, more time put aside to ponder the consequences, but that would have been the case regardless. It was time to act. The latest drugs meant that AIDS was now rarely fatal, at least not to those who could afford the treatment. The third millennium was fast approaching, a symbolic opportunity not to be ignored. Shawcross was doing God's work. What need did he have for quality control? True, he was an imperfect human instrument in God's hands, and at every stage of the task he had blundered and failed in a dozen times and ways before achieving perfection, but that was in the laboratory, where mistakes could be discovered and rectified easily. Surely God would never permit anything less than an infallible virus. His will made RNA out into the world. So Shawcross visited a travel agent, then infected himself with SVA. Shawcross went west, crossing the Pacific at once, saving his own continent for last. He stuck to large population centers: Tokyo, Beijing, Seoul, Bangkok, Manila, Sydney, New Delhi, Cairo. SVA could survive indefinitely, dormant but potentially infectious on any surface that wasn't intentionally sterilized. The seats in a jet, the furniture in a hotel room aren't autoclaved all that often. Shawcross didn't visit prostitutes. It was SVA that he wanted to spread, and SVA was not a venereal disease. Instead, he simply played the tourist, sightseeing, shopping, catching public transport, swimming in hotel pools. He relaxed at a frantic pace, adopting a schedule of remorseless recreation that, he soon felt, only divine intervention sustained. Not surprisingly, by the time he reached London, he was a wreck, a sun-tanned zombie in a fading floral shirt, with eyes as glazed as the multi-coated lens of his obligatory, if filmless, camera. Tiredness, jet lag, and endless changes of cuisine and surroundings, paradoxically made worse by an underlying glutinous monotony to be found in food and cities alike, had all worked together to slowly drag him down into a muddy, dreamlike state of mind. He dreamed of airports and hotels and jets, and woke in the same places, unable to distinguish between memories and dreams. His faith held out through it all, of course, invulnerably axiomatic, but he worried none the less. High-altitude jet travel meant extra exposure to cosmic rays. Could he be certain that the virus's mechanisms for self-checking and mutation repair were fail-safe? God would be watching over all the trillions of replications, but still he would feel better when he was home again, and could test the strain he'd been carrying for any evidence of defects. Exhausted, he stayed in his hotel room for days, when he should have been out jostling Londoners, not to mention the crowds of international tourists making the best of the end of summer. News of his plague was only now beginning to grow beyond isolated items about mystery deaths. Health authorities were investigating, but had had little time to assemble all the data, and were naturally reluctant to make premature announcements. It was too late anyway. Even if Shawcross had been found and quarantined at once, and all national frontiers sealed, people he had infected so far would already have taken SVA to every corner of the globe. He missed his flight to Dublin. He missed his flight to Ontario. He ate and slept, and dreamed of eating, sleeping, and dreaming. The Times arrived each morning on his breakfast tray, each day devoting more and more space to proof of his success, but still lacking the special kind of headline he longed for, a black and white acknowledgment of the plague's divine purpose. Experts began declaring that all the signs pointed to a biological weapon run amok, with Libya and Iraq the prime suspects. Sources in Israeli intelligence had confirmed that both countries had greatly expanded their research programs in recent years. If any epidemiologist had realized that only adulterers and homosexuals were dying, the idea had not yet filtered through to the press. Eventually, Shawcross checked out of the hotel. There was no need for him to travel through Canada, the States, or Central and South America. All the news showed that other travelers had long since done his job for him. He booked a flight home, but had 9 hours to kill. I will do no such thing. Now take your money and get out. But straight sex, it says in the foyer. Can't you read? I don't want sex. I won't touch you. You don't understand. I want you to touch yourself. I only want to be tempted. Well, walk down the street with both eyes open. That should be temptation enough. The woman glared at him, but Shawcross didn't budge. There was an important principle at stake. I've paid you, he whined. She dropped the notes on his lap. And now you have your money back. Good night. He climbed to his feet. God's going to punish you. You're going to die a horrible death, blood leaking out of all of your veins. There'll be blood leaking out of you if I have to call the lads to assist you off the premises. Haven't you read about the plague? Don't you realize what it is, what it means? It's God's punishment for fornicators. Oh, get out, you blaspheming lunatic. Blaspheming? Shawcross was stunned. You don't know who you're talking to. I'm God's chosen instrument. She scowled at him. You're the devil's own arsehole, that's what you are. Now clear off. As Shawcross tried to stare her down, a peculiar dizziness took hold of him. She was going to die, and he would be responsible. For several seconds, this simple realization sat unchallenged in his brain. Naked, awful, obscene in its clarity. He waited for the usual chorus of abstractions and rationalizations to rise up and conceal it. And waited. Finally, he knew that he couldn't leave the room without doing his best to save her life. Listen to me. Take this money and let me talk, that's all. Let me talk for 5 minutes, then I'll go. Talk about what? The plague. Listen. I know more about the plague than anyone else on the planet. The woman mimed disbelief and impatience. It's true. I'm an expert virologist. I work for the Centers of Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia. Everything I'm going to tell you will be made public in a couple of days, but I'm telling you now because you're at risk from this job, and in a couple of days it might be too late. He explained, in the simplest language he could manage, the 4 stages of the virus, the concept of a stored host fingerprint, the fatal consequences if a third person's SVM ever entered her blood. She sat through it all in silence. Do you understand what I've said? Sure I do. That doesn't mean I believe it. He leaped to his feet and shook her.
I'm deadly serious. I'm telling you the absolute truth. God is punishing adulterers. AIDS was just a warning. This time no sinner will escape. No one.
She removed his hands. Your God and my God don't have a lot in common.
Your God, he spat.
Oh, and aren't I entitled to one? Excuse me. I thought they'd put it in some United Nations charter. Everyone's issued with their own God at birth, though if you break him or lose him along the way, there's no free replacement.
Now who's blaspheming?
She shrugged. Well, my God's still functioning, but yours sounds a bit of a disaster. Mine might not cure all the problems in the world, but at least he doesn't bend over backwards to make them worse. Shawcross was indignant.
A few people will die, a few sinners, it can't be helped. But think of what the world will be like when the message finally gets through. No unfaithfulness, no rape, every marriage lasting until death.
She grimaced with distaste. For all the wrong reasons.
No, it might start out that way. People are weak, they need a reason, a selfish reason, to be good. But given time, it will grow to be more than that. A habit, then a tradition, then part of human nature. The virus won't matter anymore. People will have changed.
Well, maybe. If monogamy is inheritable, I suppose natural selection would eventually. Shawcross stared at her, wondering if he was losing his mind, then screamed,
Stop it! There is no such thing as natural selection.
He'd never been lectured on Darwinism in any brothel back home, but then what could he expect in a country run by godless socialists? He calmed down slightly and added,
I meant a change in the spiritual values of the world culture.
The woman shrugged, unmoved by the outburst. I know you don't give a damn what I think, but I'm going to tell you anyway. You are the saddest, most screwed up man I've set eyes on all week. So if you've chosen a particular moral code to live by, that's your right, and good luck to you. But you have no real faith in what you're doing. You're so uncertain of your choice that you need God to pour down fire and brimstone on everyone who's chosen differently, just to prove to you that you're right. God fails to oblige, so you hunt through the natural disasters, earthquakes, floods, famines, epidemics, winnowing out examples of the punishment of sinners. You think you're proving that God's on your side? All you're proving is your own insecurity. She glanced at her watch. Well, your 5 minutes are long gone, and I never talk theology for free. I've got one last question, though, if you don't mind, since you're likely to be the last expert virologist I run into for a while.
Ask.
She was going to die. He'd done his best to save her, and he'd failed. Well, hundreds of thousands would die with her. He had no choice but to accept that. His faith would keep him sane. This virus that your gods designed is only supposed to harm adulterers and gays, right?
Yes, haven't you listened? That's the whole point. The mechanism is ingenious. The DNA fingerprint.
She spoke very slowly, opening her mouth extra wide, as if addressing a deaf or demented person. Suppose some sweet monogamous married couple have sex. Suppose the woman becomes pregnant. The child won't have exactly the same set of genes as either parent. So what happens to it? What happens to the baby? Shawcross just stared at her. What happens to the baby? His mind was blank. He was tired, he was homesick. All the pressure, all the worries. He'd been through an ordeal. How could she expect him to think straight? How could she expect him to explain every tiny detail? What happens to the baby? What happens to the innocent, newly made child? He struggled to concentrate, to organize his thoughts, but the absolute horror of what she was suggesting tugged at his attention, like a tiny, cold, insistent hand, dragging him inch by inch toward madness. Suddenly he burst into laughter. He almost wept with relief. He shook his head at the stupid whore and said,
You can't trick me like that. I thought of babies back in '94, at little Joel's christening. He's my cousin's boy.
He grinned and shook his head again, giddy with happiness.
I fixed the problem. I added genes to SVC and SVM for surface receptors to half a dozen fetal blood proteins. If any of the receptors are activated, the next generation of the virus is pure SVA. It's even safe to breastfeed for about a month because the fetal proteins take a while to be replaced.
For about a month, echoed the woman. Then, what do you mean, you added genes? Shawcross was already bolting from the room. He ran aimlessly until he was breathless and stumbling. Then he limped through the streets, clutching his head, ignoring the stares and insults of passerby. A month wasn't long enough. He'd known that all along, but somehow he'd forgotten just what it was he'd intended to do about it. There'd been too many details, too many complications. Already children would be dying. He came to a halt in a deserted side street, behind a row of tawdry nightclubs, and slumped to the ground. He sat against a cold brick wall, shivering and hugging himself. Muffled music reached him, thin and distorted. Where had he gone wrong? Hadn't he taken his revelation of God's purpose in creating AIDS to its logical conclusion? Hadn't he devoted his whole life to perfecting a biological machine, able to discern good from evil? If something so hideously complex, so painstakingly contrived as his virus still couldn't do the job. Waves of blackness moved across his vision. What if he'd been wrong from the start? What if none of his work had been God's will after all? Shawcross contemplated this idea with a shell-shocked kind of tranquility. It was too late to halt the spread of the virus, but he could go to the authorities and arm them with the details that would otherwise take them years to discover. Once they knew about the fetal protein receptors, a protective drug exploiting that knowledge might be possible in a matter of months. Such a drug would enable breastfeeding, blood transfusions, and organ transplants. It would also allow adulterers to copulate and homosexuals to practice their abominations. It would be utterly morally neutral, the negation of everything he'd lived for. He stared up at the blank sky with a growing sense of panic. Could he do that? Tear himself down and start again? He had to. Children were dying. Somehow he had to find the courage. Then it happened. Grace was restored. His faith flooded back like a tide of light, banishing his preposterous doubts. How could he have contemplated surrender when the real solution was so obvious, so simple? He staggered to his feet, then broke into a run again, reciting to himself over and over to be sure he'd get it right this time. Adulterers, sodomites, mothers breastfeeding infants over the age of 4 weeks, repent and be saved. And that was The Moral Virologist by Greg Egan. So, The Moral Virologist. A comedy in the sense that it is nominally satirical, I guess. Depressing, because a nutter who wants to proselytize in the most aggressive way possible and hold everyone in the world to his specific belief code, decides, hey, wouldn't it be a great idea to make something that makes AIDS look like a friggin' walk in the park? What a scumbag. I guess that is really proof, kids, that you shouldn't go into the field of molecular biology with the express purpose of creating a civilization-ending supervirus, because you probably will forget something and look kind of like an idiot. So don't do it, kids. Don't do it. Alrighty, fluid in my lungs. Everywhere but my lungs, I hope. All right, next up is Closer. Again, this is the return
of the Ndoli device, which you may remember from that other one where the guy realizes or finds out that he has been the jewel, the personality saved by the jewel all along, and not the personality saved in the meaty brain. Okay. Bunch of dust clogging up my nose. Alrighty. I just lost my page. Nice work. Uh, aha! Here we go. Closer by Greg Egan. Nobody wants to spend eternity alone. Intimacy, I once told Cyan after we'd made love, is the only cure for solipsism. She laughed and said, "Don't get too ambitious, Michael. So far it hasn't even cured me of masturbation." True solipsism, though, was never my problem. From the very first time I considered the question, I accepted that there could be no way of proving the reality of an external world, let alone the existence of other minds. But I also accepted that taking both on faith was the only practical way of dealing with everyday life. The question which obsessed me was this: assuming that other people existed, how did they apprehend that existence? How did they experience being? Could I ever truly understand what consciousness was like for another person, any more than I could for an ape or a cat or an insect? If not, I was alone. I desperately wanted to believe that other people were somehow knowable, but it wasn't something I could bring myself to take for granted. I knew there could be no absolute proof, but I wanted to be persuaded. I needed to be compelled. No literature, no poetry, no drama, however personally resonant I found it, could ever quite convince me that I'd glimpsed the author's soul. Language had evolved to facilitate cooperation in the conquest of the physical world, not to describe subjective reality. Love, anger, jealousy, resentment, grief, all were defined, ultimately, in terms of external circumstances and observable actions. When an image or metaphor rang true for me, it proved only that I shared with the author a set of definitions, a culturally sanctioned list of word associations. After all, many publishers used computer programs, highly specialized but unsophisticated algorithms without the remotest possibility of self awareness, to routinely produce both literature and literary criticism indistinguishable from the human product. Not just formularized garbage either. On several occasions, I'd been deeply affected by works which I'd later discovered had been cranked out by unthinking software. This didn't prove that human literature communicated nothing of the author's inner life, but it certainly made clear how much room there was for doubt. Unlike many of my friends, I had no qualms whatsoever when, at the age of 18, the time came for me to switch. My organic brain was removed and discarded, and control of my body handed over to my jewel, the Endoli device, a neural net computer implanted shortly after birth, which had since learned to imitate my brain, down to the level of individual neurons. I had no qualms, not because I was at all convinced that the jewel and the brain experienced consciousness identically, but because, from an early age, I'd identified myself solely with the jewel. My brain was a kind of bootstrap device, nothing more, and to mourn its loss would have been as absurd as mourning my emergence from some primitive stage of embryological neural development. Switching was simply what humans did now, an established part of the life cycle, even if it was mediated by our culture and not by our genes. Seeing each other die and observing the gradual failure of their own bodies may have helped convince pre-Ndoli humans of their common humanity. Certainly, there were countless references in their literature to the equalizing power of death. Perhaps concluding that the universe would go on without them
produced a shared sense of hopelessness or insignificance, which they viewed as their defining attribute. Now that it's become an article of faith that, sometime in the next few billion years, physicists will find a way for us to go on without the universe, rather than vice versa, that route to spiritual equality has lost whatever dubious logic it might ever have possessed. Cyan was a communications engineer. I was a holovision news editor. We met during a live broadcast of the seeding of Venus with terraforming nanomachines, a matter of great public interest since most of the planet's as yet uninhabitable surface had already been sold. There were several technical glitches with the broadcast which might have been disastrous, but together we managed to work around them, and even to hide the seams. It was nothing special, we were simply doing our jobs, but afterward I was elated out of all proportion. It took me 24 hours to realize, or decide, that I'd fallen in love. However, when I approached her the next day, she made it clear that she felt nothing for me. The chemistry I'd imagined between us had all been in my head. I was dismayed, but not surprised. Work didn't bring us together again, but I called her occasionally, and 6 weeks later my persistence was rewarded. I took her to a performance of Waiting for Godot by Augmented Parrots, and I enjoyed myself immensely, but I didn't see her again for more than a month. I'd almost given up hope when she appeared at my door without warning one night and dragged me along to a concert of interactive computerized improvisation. The audience was assembled in what looked like a mock up of a Berlin nightclub of the 2050s. A computer program, originally designed for creating movie scores, was fed with the image from a hover camera which wandered about the set. People danced and sang, screamed and brawled, and engaged in all kinds of histrionics in the hope of attracting the camera and shaping the music. At first I felt cowed and inhibited, but Cyan gave me no choice but to join in. It was chaotic, insane, at times even terrifying. One woman stabbed another to death at the table beside us, which struck me as a sickening and expensive indulgence. But when a riot broke out at the end and people started smashing the deliberately flimsy furniture, I followed Cyan back into the melee, cheering. The music, the excuse for the whole event, was garbage, but I didn't really care. When we limped out into the night, bruised and aching and laughing, I knew that at least we'd shared something that had made us feel closer. She took me home and we went to bed together, too sore and tired to do more than sleep. But when we made love in the morning, I already felt so at ease with her that I could hardly believe it was our first time. Soon we were inseparable. My tastes in entertainment were very different from hers, but I survived most of her favorite art forms, more or less intact. She moved into my apartment, at my suggestion, and casually destroyed the orderly rhythms of my carefully arranged domestic life. I had to piece together details of her past from the throwaway lines. She found it far too boring to sit down and give me a coherent account. Her life had been as unremarkable as mine. She'd grown up in a suburban, middle-class family, studied her profession, found a job. Like almost everyone, she'd switched at 18. She had no strong political convictions. She was good at her work, but put 10 times more energy into her social life. She was intelligent, but hated anything overtly intellectual. She was impatient, aggressive, roughly affectionate. And I could not, for 1 second, imagine what it was like inside her head. For a start, I rarely had any idea what she was thinking, in the sense of knowing how she would have replied if asked, out of the blue, to describe her thoughts at the moment before they were interrupted by the question. On a longer time scale, I had no feeling for her motivation, her image of herself, her concept of who she was and what she did and why. Even in the laughably crude sense that a novelist pretends to explain a character, I could not have explained Cyan. And if she provided me with a running commentary on her mental state and a weekly assessment of the reasons for her actions in the latest psychodynamic jargon, it would all have come to nothing but a heap of useless words. If I could have pictured myself in her circumstances, imagined myself with her beliefs and obsessions, empathized until I could anticipate her every word, her every decision, then I still would not have understood so much as a single moment when she closed her eyes, forget her past, wanted nothing, and simply was. Of course, most of the time, nothing could have mattered less. We were happy enough together, whether or not we were strangers, and whether or not my happiness and Cyan's happiness were in any real sense the same. Over the years, she became less self contained, more open. She had no great dark secrets to share, no traumatic childhood ordeals to recount, but she let me in on her petty fears and her mundane neuroses. I did the same, and even, clumsily, explained my peculiar obsession. She wasn't at all offended, just puzzled. What could it actually mean, though, to know what it's like to be someone else? You'd have to have their memories, their personality, their body, everything. And then you'd just be them, not yourself, and you wouldn't know anything. It's nonsense. I shrugged. Not necessarily. Of course, perfect knowledge would be impossible, but you can always get closer. Don't you think that the more things we do together, the more experiences we share, the closer we become? She scowled. Yes, but that's not what you were talking about 5 seconds ago. 2 years or 2,000 years of shared experiences seen through different eyes means nothing. However much time two people spent together, how could you know that there was even the briefest instant when they both experienced what they were going through together in the same way? I know, but if you admit that what you want is impossible, maybe you'll stop fretting about it. I laughed. Whatever makes you think I'm as irrational as that? When the technology became available, it was Cyan's idea, not mine, for us to try out all the fashionable somatic permutations. Cyan was always impatient to experience something new. If we really are going to live forever, she said, we'd better stay curious if we want to stay sane. I was reluctant, but any resistance I put up seemed hypocritical. Clearly, this game wouldn't lead to the perfect knowledge I longed for, and knew I would never achieve. But I couldn't deny the possibility that it might be one crude step in the right direction. First, we exchanged bodies. I discovered what it was like to have breasts and a vagina, what it was like for me, that is, not what it had been like for Cyan. True, we stayed swapped long enough for the shock and even the novelty to wear off, but I never felt that I'd gained much insight into her experience of the body she'd been born with. My jewel was modified only as much as was necessary to allow me to control this unfamiliar machine, which was scarcely more than would have been required to work another male body. The menstrual cycle had been abandoned decades before, and although I could have taken the necessary hormones to allow myself to have periods, and even to become pregnant, although the financial disincentives for reproduction had been drastically increased in recent years, that would have told me absolutely nothing about Cyan, who had done neither. As for sex, the pleasure of intercourse still felt very much the same, which was hardly surprising, since nerves from the vagina and clitoris were simply wired into my jewel as if they'd come from my penis. Even being penetrated made less difference than I'd expected. Unless I made a special effort to remain aware of our respective geometries, I found it hard to care who was doing what to whom. Orgasms were better, though, I had to admit. At work, no one raised an eyebrow when I turned up as Cyan, since many of my colleagues had already been through exactly the same thing. The legal definition of identity had recently been shifted from the DNA fingerprint of the body, according to a standard set of markers, to the serial number of the jewel. When even the law can keep up with you, you know you can't be doing anything very radical or profound. After 3 months, Cyan had had enough. I never realized how clumsy you were, she said, or that ejaculation was so dull. Next, she had a clone of herself made, so that we could both be women. brain-damaged replacement bodies, extras, had once been incredibly expensive, but they needed to be grown at virtually the normal rate and kept constantly active so they'd be healthy enough to use. However, the physiological effects of the passage of time and of exercise don't happen by magic. At a deep enough level, there's always a biochemical signal produced, which can ultimately be faked. Mature extras, with sturdy bones and perfect muscle tones, could now be produced from scratch in a year, 4 months gestation and 8 months coma, which also allowed them to be more thoroughly brain dead than before, soothing the ethical qualms of those who'd always wondered just how much was going on inside the heads of the old, active versions. In our first experiment, the hardest part for me had always been not looking in the mirror and seeing Cyan, but looking at Cyan and seeing myself. I'd missed her far more than I'd missed being myself. Now I was almost happy for my body to be absent, in storage, kept alive by a jewel based on the minimal brain of an extra. The symmetry of being her twin appealed to me. Surely now we were closer than ever. Before, we'd merely swapped our physical differences. Now we'd abolished them. The symmetry was an illusion. I'd changed gender, and she hadn't. I was with the woman I loved. She lived with a walking parody of herself. One morning she woke me, pummeling my breast so hard that she left bruises. When I opened my eyes and shielded myself, she peered at me suspiciously. "Are you in there? Michael? I'm going crazy. I want you back." For the sake of getting the whole bizarre episode over and done with for good, and perhaps also to discover for myself what Cyan had just been through, I agreed to the third permutation. There was no need to wait a year. My extra had been grown at the same time as hers. Somehow, it was far more disorienting to be confronted by myself without the camouflage of Cyan's body. I found my own face unreadable. When we'd both been in disguise, that hadn't bothered me, but now it made me feel edgy, and at times almost paranoid, for no rational reason at all. Sex took some getting used to. Eventually, I found it pleasurable in a confusing and vaguely narcissistic way. The compelling sense of equality I'd felt when we'd made love as women never quite returned to me as we sucked each other's cocks, but then when we'd both been women, Cyan had never claimed to feel any such thing. It had all been on my own. It had all been my own invention. The day after we returned to the way we'd begun, well, almost. In fact, we put our decrepit 26-year-old bodies in storage and took up residence in our healthier extras, I saw a story from Europe on an option we hadn't tried yet. Tipped to become all the rage. Hermaphroditic identical twins. Our new bodies could be our biological children, give or take the genetic tinkering required to ensure hermaphroditism, with an equal share of characteristics from both of us. We would both have changed gender, both have lost partners. We'd be equal in every way. I took a copy of the file home to Cyan. She watched it thoughtfully, then said, "Slugs are hermaphrodites, aren't they? They hang in midair together on a thread of slime. I'm sure there's something in Shakespeare remarking on the glorious spectacle of copulating slugs. Imagine it, you and me making slug love." I fell on the floor, laughing. I stopped suddenly. Where in Shakespeare? I didn't think you'd even read Shakespeare. Eventually, I came to believe that with each passing year I knew Cyan a little better, in the traditional sense, the sense that most couples seem to find sufficient. I knew what she expected from me, I knew how not to hurt her. We had arguments, we had fights, but there must have been some kind of underlying stability, because in the end we always chose to stay together. Her happiness mattered to me very much. And at times I could hardly believe that I'd ever thought it possible that all of her subjective experience might be fundamentally alien to mine. It was true that every brain, and hence every jewel, was unique, but there was something extravagant in supposing that the nature of consciousness could be radically different between individuals, when the same basic hardware and the same basic principles of neural topology were involved. Still, sometimes, if I woke in the night, I'd turn to her and whisper, inaudibly, compulsively, "I don't know you. I have no idea who or what you are. I'd lie there and think about packing and leaving. I was alone, and it was farcical to go through the charade of pretending otherwise. Then again, sometimes I woke in the night absolutely convinced that I was dying, or something else equally absurd. In the sway of some half forgotten dream, all manner of confusion is possible. It never meant a thing, and by morning I was always myself again. When I saw the story on Craig Bentley's service, he called it research, but his volunteers paid for the privilege of taking part in his experiments. I almost couldn't bring myself to include it in the bulletin, although all my professional judgment told me it was everything our viewers wanted in a 30-second techno shock piece. Bizarre, even mildly disconcerting, but not too hard to grasp. Bentley was a cyber neurologist. He studied the Indoli device in the way that neurologists had once studied the brain. Mimicking the brain with a neural net computer had not required a profound understanding of its higher level structures. Research into these structures continued in their new incarnation. The jewel, compared to the brain, was of course both easier to observe and easier to manipulate. In his latest project, Bentley was offering couples something slightly more upmarket than an insight into the sex lives of slugs. He was offering them 8 hours with identical minds. I made a copy of the original 10-minute piece that had come through on the fiber, then let my editing console select the most titillating 30 seconds possible for broadcast. It did a good job. It had learned from me. I couldn't lie to Cyan. I couldn't hide the story. I couldn't pretend I wasn't interested. The only honest thing to do was to show her the file, tell her exactly how I felt, and ask her what she wanted. I did just that. When the HV image faded out, she turned to me, shrugged, and said mildly, "Okay, sounds like fun. Let's try it." Bentley wore a t-shirt with 9 computer-drawn portraits on it, in a 3 by 3 grid. Top left was Elvis Presley. Bottom right was Marilyn Monroe. The rest were various stages in between.
This is how it'll work. The transition will take 20 minutes, during which time you'll be disembodied. Over the first 10 minutes, you'll gain equal access to each other's memories. Over the second 10 minutes, you'll both be moved gradually toward the compromised personality. Once that's done, your Indoli devices will be identical, in the sense that both will have all the same neural connections with all the same weighting factors, but they'll almost certainly be in different states. I'll have to black you out to correct that. Then you'll wake. Who'll wake? In identical electromechanical bodies. Clones can't be made sufficiently alike. You'll spend the 8 hours alone in perfectly matched rooms. Rather like hotel suites, really. You'll have HV to keep you amused if you need it, without the videophone module, of course. You might think you'd both get an engaged signal if you tried to call the same number simultaneously, but in fact, in such cases, the switching equipment arbitrarily lets one call through, which would make your environments different.
Cyan asked, "Why can't we phone each other? Or better still, meet each other. If we're exactly the same, we'd say the same things, do the same things. We'd be one more identical part of each other's environment." Bentley pursed his lips and shook his head.
Perhaps I'll allow something of the kind in a future experiment, but for now I believe it would be too potentially traumatic.
Cyan gave me a sideways glance, which meant, "This man is a killjoy."
The end will be like the beginning in reverse. First, your personalities will be restored. Then you'll lose access to each other's memories. Of course, your memories of the experience itself will be left untouched. Untouched by me, that is. I can't predict how your separate personalities, once restored, will act. Filtering, suppressing, reinterpreting those memories. Within minutes, you may end up with very different ideas about what you've been through. All I can guarantee is this. For the 8 hours in question, the two of you will be identical.
We talked it over.
Cyan was enthusiastic as always. She didn't much care what it would be like. All that really mattered to her was collecting one more novel experience. Whatever happens, we'll be ourselves again at the end of it, she said. What's there to be afraid of? You know the old Indoli joke. What old Indoli joke? Anything's bearable, so long as it's finite. I couldn't decide how I felt. The sharing of memories notwithstanding, we'd both end up knowing, not each other, but merely a transient artificial third person. Still, for the first time in our lives, we would have been through exactly the same experience from exactly the same point of view, even if the experience was only spending 8 hours locked in separate rooms and the point of view was that of a genderless robot with an identity crisis. It was a compromise, but I could think of no realistic way in which it could have been improved. I called Bentley and made a reservation. In perfect sensory deprivation, my thoughts seemed to dissipate into the blackness around me before they were even half formed. This isolation didn't last long, though. As our short-term memories merged, we achieved a kind of telepathy. One of us would think a message and the other would remember thinking it and reply in the same way. I really can't wait to uncover all your grubby little secrets. I think you're going to be disappointed. Anything I haven't already told you, I've probably repressed. Ah, but repressed is not erased. Who knows what will turn up? We'll know soon enough. I tried to think of all the minor sins I must have committed over the years, all the shameful, selfish, unworthy thoughts, but nothing came into my head but a vague white noise of guilt. I tried again, and achieved, of all things, an image of Cyan as a child, a young boy slipping his hand between her legs, then squealing with fright and pulling away. But she'd described that incident to me long ago. Was it her memory or my reconstruction? My memory, I think, or perhaps my reconstruction. You know, half the time when I've told you something that happened before we met, the memory of the telling has become far clearer to me than the memory itself, almost replacing it. It's the same for me. Then in a way our memories have already been moving toward a kind of symmetry for years. We both remember what was said as if we'd both heard it from someone else. Agreement. Silence. A moment of confusion. Then, this neat division of memory and personality Bentley uses, is it really so clear? Jewels are neural net computers. You can't talk about data and program in any absolute sense. Not in general, no. His classification must be arbitrary to some extent, but who cares? It matters. If he restores personality but allows memories to persist, a misclassification could leave us what? It depends, doesn't it? And one extreme so thoroughly restored, so completely unaffected that the whole experience might as well not have happened. At the other extreme, permanently closer. Isn't that the point? I don't know anymore. Silence. Hesitation. Then I realized that I had no idea whether or not it was my turn to reply. I woke, lying on a bed, mildly bemused, as if waiting for a mental hiatus to pass. My body felt slightly awkward, but less so than when I'd woken in someone else's extra. I glanced down at the pale, smooth plastic of my torso and legs, then waved a hand in front of my face. I looked like a unisex shop window dummy, but Bentley had shown us the bodies beforehand. It was no great shock. I sat up slowly, then stood and took a few steps. I felt a little numb and hollow, but my kinesthetic sense, my, oh boy, proprioception, was fine. Proprioception? That's a new one on me. I felt located between my eyes, and I felt that this body was mine. As with any modern transplant, my jewel had been manipulated directly to accommodate the change, avoiding the need for months of physiotherapy. I glanced around the room. It was sparsely furnished, one bed, one table, one chair, one clock, one HV set. On the wall, a framed reproduction of an Escher lithograph. Bond of Union. A portrait of the artist and, presumably his wife, faces peeled like lemons into helices of rind, joined into a single linked band. I traced the outer surface from start to finish, and was disappointed to find that it lacked the Mobius twist I was expecting. No windows, one door without a handle. Set into the wall beside the bed, a full-length mirror. I stood a while and stared at my ridiculous form. It suddenly occurred to me that, if Bentley had a real love of symmetry games, he might have built one room as the mirror image of the other, modified the HV set accordingly, and altered one jewel, one copy of me, to exchange right for left. What looked like a mirror could then be nothing but a window between the rooms. I grinned awkwardly with my plastic face. My reflection looked appropriately embarrassed by the sight. The idea appealed to me, however unlikely it was. Nothing short of an experiment in nuclear physics could reveal the difference. No, not true. A pendulum free to precess, like Foucault's, would would twist the same way in both rooms, giving the game away. I walked up to the mirror and thumped it. It didn't seem to yield at all, but then either a brick wall or an equal and opposite thump from behind could have been the explanation. I shrugged and turned away. Bentley might have done anything. For all I knew, the whole setup could have been a computer simulation. My body was irrelevant. The room was irrelevant. The point was... I sat on the bed. I recalled someone, Michael probably, wondering if I'd panic when I dwelt upon my nature, but I found no reason to do so. If I'd woken in this room with no recent memories and tried to sort out who I was from my pasts, I'd no doubt have gone mad, but I knew exactly who I was. I had two long trails of anticipation leading to my present state. The prospect of being changed back into Cyan or Michael didn't bother me at all. The wishes of both to regain their separate identities endured in me strongly, and the desire for personal integrity manifested itself as relief at the thought of their re-emergence, not as fear of my own demise. In any case, my memories would not be expunged, and I had no sense of having goals which one or the other of them would not pursue. I felt more like their lowest common denominator than any kind of synergistic hypermind. I was less, not more, than the sum of my parts. My purpose was strictly limited. I was here to enjoy the strangeness for Cyan and to answer a question for Michael, and when the time came I'd be happy to bifurcate and resume the two lives I remembered and valued. So, how did I experience consciousness? The same way as Michael? The same way as Cyan? So far as I could tell, I'd undergone no fundamental change. But even as I reached that conclusion, I began to wonder if I was in any position to judge. Did memories of being Michael and memories of being Siam contain so much more than the two of them could have put into words and exchanged verbally? Did I really know anything about the nature of their existence, or was my head just full of second-hand description, intimate and detailed, but ultimately as opaque as language? If my mind were radically different, would that difference be something I could even perceive? Or would all my memories in the act of remembering simply be recast into terms that seemed familiar? The past, after all, was no more knowable than the external world. Its very existence had also had to be taken on faith, and, granted existence, it too could be misleading. I buried my head in my hands, dejected. I was the closest they could get, and what had come of me? Michael's hope remained precisely as reasonable and as unproven as ever. After a while, my mood began to lighten. At least Michael's search was over, even if it had ended in failure. Now he'd have no choice but to accept that and move on. I paced around the room for a while, flicking the HV on and off. I was actually starting to get bored, but I wasn't going to waste 8 hours and several $1,000s by sitting down and watching soap operas. I mused about possible ways of undermining the synchronization of my two copies. It was conceivable that Bentley could have matched the rooms and bodies to such a fine tolerance that an engineer worthy of the name couldn't find some way of breaking the symmetry.
Even a coin toss might have done it, but I didn't have a coin. Throwing a paper plane? That sounded promising, highly sensitive to air currents, but the only paper in the room was the Escher, and I couldn't bring myself to vandalize it. I might have smashed the mirror and observed the shapes and sizes of the fragments, which would have had the added bonus of proving or disproving my earlier speculations, but as I raised the chair over my head, I suddenly changed my mind. Two conflicting sets of short-term memories had been confusing enough during the first few minutes of sensory deprivation. For several hours, interacting with a physical environment, it could be completely disabling. Better to hold off until I was desperate for amusement. So I lay down on the bed and did what most of Bentley's clients probably ended up doing. As they coalesced, Cyan and Michael had both had fears for their privacy, and both had issued compensatory, not to say defensive, mental declarations of frankness, not wanting the other to think that they had something to hide. Their curiosity, too, had been ambivalent. They'd wanted to understand each other, but, of course, not to pry. All of these contradictions continued in me, but, staring at the ceiling, trying not to look at the clock again for at least another 30 seconds, I didn't really have to make a decision. It was the most natural thing in the world to let my mind wander back over the course of their relationship from both points of view. It was a very peculiar reminiscence. Almost everything seemed at once vaguely surprising and utterly familiar, like an extended attack of deja vu. It's not that they'd often set out deliberately to deceive each other about anything substantial, but all the tiny white lies, all the concealed trivial resentments, all the necessary, laudable, essential, loving deceptions that had kept them together in spite of their differences, filled my head with a strange haze of confusion and disillusionment. It wasn't in any sense a conversation. I was no multiple personality. Cyan and Michael simply weren't there, to justify, to explain, to deceive each other all over again, with the best of intentions. Perhaps I should have attempted to do all this on their behalf, but I was constantly unsure of my role, unable to decide on a position. So I lay there, paralyzed by symmetry, and let their memories flow. After that, the time passed so quickly that I never had a chance to break the mirror. We tried to stay together. We lasted a week. Bentley had made, as the law required, snapshots of our jewels prior to the experiment. We could have gone back to them, and then had him explain to us why, but self-deception is only an easy choice if you make it in time. We couldn't forgive each other, because there was nothing to forgive. Neither of us had done a single thing that the other could fail to understand and sympathize with completely. We knew each other too well, that's all. Detail after tiny fucking microscopic detail. It wasn't that the truth hurt. It didn't any longer. It numbed us. It smothered us. We didn't know each other as we knew ourselves. It was worse than that. In the self, the details blur in the very processes of thought. Mental self-dissection is possible, but it takes great effort to sustain. Our mutual dissection took no effort at all. It was the natural state into which we fell in each other's presence. Our surfaces had been stripped away, but not to reveal a glimpse of the soul. All we could see beneath the skin were the cogs spinning. And I knew now that what Cyan had always wanted most in a lover was the alien, the unknowable, the mysterious, the opaque. The whole point for her of being with someone else was the sense of confronting otherness. Without it, she believed, you might as well be talking to yourself. I found that I now shared this view, a change whose precise origins I didn't much want to think about. But then, I'd always known she had the stronger personality. I should have guessed that something would rub off. Together, we might as well have been alone, so we had no choice but to part. Nobody wants to spend eternity alone. And that was Closer by Greg Egan.
How about that, huh?
A couple decides. Oh, sorry. Stretching while talking. Not as easy as it sounds. Very crunchy. A couple decides to take part in this experiment. For one, because it'll be a new novel experience. Another, because it'll answer uh, a question that's been hounding them their entire life. And at the end, they know each other so well that they might as well be the same person. Their personalities merged a bit too effectively and thoroughly, so they couldn't see the dividing lines. Or they could, uh, but they knew the other so well that they could probably have predicted what they'd do or what they'd say if ever asked, because they now know them totally, completely, perfectly. And all the little things we do to keep a relationship functioning sort of backfired in a way. All right. Uh, give me give me about 1 minute. I'll be right back. Um, I'm just grabbing another glass of water here. I shall return shortly. Alrighty, and I am back. Sorry about that. All right, and moving onwards to the last story in here, which is called Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies. This one is a bit shorter, but a bit more uplifting. It's a reasonably uplifting, or nebulously uplifting ending. Uh, so, come on. There we go. Alrighty, moving right along. Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies by Greg Egan. I always feel safest sleeping on the freeway, or at least those stretches of it that happen to lie in regions of approximate equilibrium between the surrounding attractors. With our sleeping bags laid out carefully along the fading white lines between the northbound lanes, perhaps because of a faint hint of geomancy reaching up from Chinatown not quite drowned out by the influence of scientific humanism from the East, liberal Judaism from the West, and some vehement anti spiritual, anti intellectual hedonism from the North. I can close my eyes, safe in the knowledge that Maria and I are not going to wake up believing wholeheartedly and irrevocably in papal infallibility, the sentience of Gaia, the delusions of insight induced by meditation, or the miraculous healing powers of tax reform. So, when I wake to find the sun already clear on the horizon, and Maria gone, I don't panic. No faith, no worldview, no belief system, no culture could have reached out in the night and claimed her. The borders of the basins of attraction do fluctuate, advancing and retreating by tens of meters daily, but it's highly unlikely that any of them could have penetrated this far into our precious wasteland of anomie and doubt. I can't think why she would have walked off and left me without a word, but Maria does things now and then that I find wholly inexplicable, and vice versa. Even after a year together, we still have that. I don't panic, but I don't linger either. I don't want to get too far behind. I rise to my feet, stretching, and try to decide which way she would have headed. Unless the local conditions have changed since she departed, that should be much the same as asking where I want to go myself. The attractors can't be fought, they can't be resisted, but it is possible to steer a course between them, to navigate the contradictions. The easiest ways to start out is to make use of a strong but moderately distant attractor to build up momentum, while taking care to arrange to be deflected at the last minute by a countervailing influence. Choosing the first attractor, the belief to which surrender must be feigned, is always a strange business. Sometimes it feels almost literally like sniffing the wind, like following an external trail. Sometimes it seems like pure introspection, like trying to determine my own true beliefs. And sometimes the whole idea of making a distinction between these apparent opposites seems misguided. Yeah, very fucking zen. And that's how it strikes me now, which in itself just about answers the question. The balance here is delicate, but one influence is marginally stronger. Eastern philosophies are definitely more compelling than the alternatives from where I stand, and knowing the purely geographical reasons for this doesn't really make it any less true. I piss on the chain link fence between the freeway and the railway line to hasten its decay, then I roll up my sleeping bag, take a swig of water from my canteen, hoist my pack, and start walking. A bakery's robot delivery van speeds past me, and I curse my solitude. Without elaborate preparations, it takes at least two agile people to make use of them, one to block the vehicle's path, the other to steal the food. Losses through theft are small enough that the people of the attractors seem to tolerate them. Presumably, greater security measures just aren't worth the cost, although no doubt the inhabitants of each ethical monoculture have their own unique reasons for not starving us amoral tramps into submission. I take out a sickly carrot which I dug from one of my vegetable gardens when I passed by last night. It makes a pathetic breakfast, but as I chew on it, I think about the bread rolls that I'll steal when I'm back with Maria again, and my anticipation almost overshadows the bland, woody taste of the present. The freeway curves gently southeast. I reach a section flanked by deserted factories and abandoned houses, and against this background of relative silence, the tug of Chinatown, straight ahead now, grows stronger and clearer. That glib label, Chinatown, was always an oversimplification, of course. Before Meltdown, the area contained at least a dozen distinct cultures besides Hong Kong and Malaysian Chinese, from Korean to Cambodian, from Thai to Timorese, and several varieties of every religion from Buddhism to Islam. All of that diversity has vanished now, and the homogeneous amalgam that finally stabilized would probably seem utterly bizarre to any individual pre meltdown inhabitant of the district. To the present day citizens, of course, the strange hybrid feels exactly right. That's the definition of stability, the whole reason the attractors exist. If I marched right into Chinatown, not only would I find myself sharing the local values and beliefs, I'd be perfectly happy to stay that way for the rest of my life. I don't expect that I'll march right in, though, any more than I expect the Earth to dive straight into the sun. It's been almost 4 years since Meltdown, and no attractor has captured me yet. I've heard dozens of explanations for the events of that day, but I find most of them equally dubious, rooted as they are in the worldviews of particular attractors. One way in which I sometimes think of it, on January 12th, 2018, the human race must have crossed some kind of unforeseen threshold, of global population perhaps, and suffered a sudden irreversible change of psychic state. Telepathy is not the right word for it. After all, nobody found themselves drowning in an ocean of babbling voices. Nobody suffered the torment of empathic overload. The mundane chatter of consciousness stayed locked inside our heads. Our quotidian mental privacy remained unbreached. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, everyone's mental privacy was so thoroughly breached that the sum of our transient thoughts forms a blanket of featureless white noise covering the planet, which the brain filters out effortlessly. In any case, for whatever reason, the second by second soap operas of other people's inner lives remained, mercifully, as inaccessible as ever, but our skulls became completely permeable to each other's values and beliefs, each other's deepest convictions. At first, this meant pure chaos. My memories of the time are confused and nightmarish. I wandered the city for a day and a night, I think, finding God, or some equivalent, anew every 6 seconds, seeing no visions, hearing no voices, but wrenched from faith to faith by invisible forces of dream logic. People moved in a daze, cowed and staggering, while ideas moved between us like lightning. Revelation followed contradictory revelation. I wanted it to stop, badly. I would have prayed for it to stop if God had stayed the same long enough to be prayed to. I've heard other tramps compare these early mystical convulsions to drug rushes, to orgasms, to being picked up and dumped by 10-meter waves, ceaselessly, hour after hour. But looking back, I find myself reminded most of a bout of gastroenteritis I once suffered, a long, feverish night of interminable vomiting and diarrhea. Every muscle, every joint in my body ached, my skin burned. I felt like I was dying. And every time I thought I lacked the strength to expel anything more from my body, another spasm took hold of me. By 4 in the morning, my helplessness seemed positively transcendental. The peristaltic reflex possessed me like some harsh but ultimately benevolent deity. At the time, it was the most religious experience I'd ever been through. All across the city, competing belief systems fought for allegiance, mutating and hybridizing along the way, like those random populations of computer viruses they used to unleash against each other in experiments to demonstrate subtle points of evolutionary theory. Or perhaps like the historical clashes of the very same beliefs, with the length and timescales drastically shortened by the new mode of interaction, and a lot less bloodshed now that the ideas themselves could do battle in a purely mental arena, rather than employing sword-wielding crusaders or extermination camps. Or like a swarm of demons set loose upon the earth to possess all but the righteous. The chaos didn't last long. In some places seeded by pre-meltdown clustering of cultures and religions, and in other places by pure chance, certain belief systems gained enough of an edge, enough of a foothold, to start spreading out from a core of believers into the surrounding random detritus, capturing adjacent, disordered populations where no dominant belief had yet emerged. The more territory these snowballing attractors conquered, the faster they grew. Fortunately, in this city at least, no single attractor was able to expand unchecked. They all ended up hemmed in, sooner or later, by equally powerful neighbors, or confined by sheer lack of population at the city's outskirts, and near voids of non-residential land. Within a week of Meltdown, the anarchy had crystallized into more or less the present configuration, with 99% of the population having moved, or changed, until they were content to be exactly where and who they were. I happened to end up between attractors, affected by many but captured by none, and I've managed to stay in orbit ever since. Whatever the knack is, I seem to have it. Over the years, the ranks of the tramps have thinned, but a core of us remain free. In the early years, the people of the attractors used to send up robot helicopters to scatter pamphlets over the city, putting their case for their respective metaphors for what had happened. As if a well chosen analogy for the disaster might be enough to win them converts. It took a while for some of them to understand that the written word had been rendered obsolete as a vector of indoctrination. Ditto for audiovisual techniques, and that still hasn't sunk in everywhere. Not long ago, on a battery powered TV set in an abandoned house, Maria and I picked up a broadcast from a network of rationalist enclaves, showing an alleged simulation of meltdown as a color coded dance of mutually carnivorous pixels, obeying a few simple mathematical rules. The commentator spouted jargon about self-organizing systems, and lo, with the magic of hindsight, the flickers of color rapidly evolved into the familiar pattern of hexagonal cells, isolated by motes of darkness, unpopulated except for the barely visible presence of a few unimportant specks. We wondered which ones were meant to be us. I don't know how things would have turned out if there hadn't been the pre-existing infrastructure of robots and telecommunications to allow people to live and work without traveling outside their own basins, the regions guaranteed to lead back to the central attractor, most of which are only a kilometer or two wide. In fact, there must be many places where that infrastructure wasn't present, but I haven't been exactly plugged into the global village these last few years, so I don't know how they've fared. Living on the margins of this society makes me even more dependent on its wealth than those who inhabit its multiple centers, so I suppose I should be glad that most people are content with the status quo. And I'm certainly delighted that they can coexist in peace, that they can trade and prosper. I'd rather die than join them, that's all. Or at least that's true right here, right now. The trick is to keep moving, to maintain momentum. There are no regions of perfect neutrality, or if there are, they're too small to find, probably too small to inhabit, and they'd almost certainly drift as the conditions within basins varied. Near enough is fine for a night, but if I tried to live in one place day after day, week after week, then whichever attractor held even the slightest advantage would, eventually, begin to sway me. Momentum and confusion. Whether or not it's true that we're spared each other's inner voices because so much uncorrelated babbling simply cancels itself out, my aim is to do just that with the more enduring, more coherent, more pernicious parts of the signal. At the very center of the earth, no doubt, the sum of all human beliefs adds up to pure, harmless noise. Here on the surface, though, where it's physically impossible to be equidistant from everyone, I'm forced to keep moving to average out the effects best I can. Sometimes I daydream about heading out into the countryside and living in glorious, clear-headed solitude beside a robot-tended farm, stealing the equipment and supplies I need to grow all my own food. With Maria? If she'll come. Sometimes she says yes, sometimes she says no. Half a dozen times we've told ourselves that we're setting out on such a journey, but we've yet to discover a trajectory out of the city, a route that would take us safely past all the intervening attractors, without being gradually deflected back toward the urban center. There must be a way out, it's simply a matter of finding it. And if all the rumors from other tramps have turned out to be dead ends, that's hardly surprising. The only people who could know for certain how to leave the city are those who've stumbled on the right path and actually departed, leaving no hints or rumors behind. Sometimes, though, I stop dead in the middle of the road and ask myself what I really want. To escape the country and lose myself in the silence of my own mute soul? To give up this pointless wandering and rejoin civilization? For the sake of prosperity, stability, certainty, to swallow and be swallowed by one elaborate set of self-affirming lies? Or to keep orbiting this way until I die? The answer, of course, depends on where I'm standing. More robot trucks pass me, but I no longer give them a second glance. I picture my hunger as an object, another weight to carry, not much heavier than my pack, and it gradually recedes from my attention. I let my mind grow blank, and I think of nothing but the early morning sunshine on my face and the pleasure of walking. After a while, a startling clarity begins to wash over me, a deep tranquillity, together with a powerful sense of understanding. The odd part is, I have no idea what it is that I think I understand. I'm experiencing the pleasure of insight without any apparent cause, without the faintest hope of replying to the question, insight into what? The feeling persists, regardless. I think, I've traveled in circles all these years, and where has it brought me? To this moment. To this chance to take my first real steps along the path to enlightenment. And all I have to do is keep walking straight ahead. For 4 years I've been following a false Tao, pursuing an illusion of freedom, striving for no reason but the sake of striving. But now I see the way to transform that journey into what? A shortcut to damnation? Damnation? There's no such thing. Only samsara, the treadmill of desires. Only the futility of striving. My understanding is clouded now, but I know that if I traveled a few steps further, the truth would soon become clear to me. For several seconds, I'm paralyzed by indecision, shot through with pure dread. But then, drawn by the possibility of redemption, I leave the freeway, clamber over the fence, and head due south. These side streets are familiar. I pass a car yard full of sun-bleached wrecks melting in slow motion, their plastic chassis triggered by disuse into auto-degradation. A video porn and sex aids shop, facade intact, dark within, stinking of rotting carpet and mouse shit. An outboard motor showroom for the latest 4-year-old fuel cell models proudly on display, already looking like bizarre relics from another century. Then the sight of the cathedral spire rising above all this squalor hits me with a giddy mixture of nostalgia and deja vu. In spite of everything, part of me still feels like a true prodigal son coming home for the first time, not passing through for the 50th. I mumble prayers and phrases of dogma, strangely comforting formulae reawakened from memories of my last perihelion. Soon, only one thing puzzles me. How could I have known God's perfect love and then walked away? It's unthinkable. How could I have turned my back on him? I come to a row of pristine houses. I know they're uninhabited, but here in the border zone, the diocesan robots keep the lawns trimmed, the leaves swept, the walls painted. A few blocks further, southwest, and I'll never turn my back on the truth again. I head that way gladly. Almost gladly. The only trouble is, with each step south, it grows harder to ignore the fact that the scriptures, let alone Catholic dogma, are full of the most grotesque errors of fact and logic. Why should a revelation from a perfect, loving God be such a dog's breakfast of threats and contradictions? Why should it offer such a flawed and confused view of humanity's place in the universe? Errors of fact? The metaphors had to be chosen to suit the worldview of the day. Should God have mystified the author of Genesis with details of the Big Bang and primordial nucleosynthesis? Contradictions? Tests of faith and humility. How can I be so arrogant as to set my wretched powers of reasoning against the word of the Almighty? God transcends everything, logic included. Logic especially. It's no good. Virgin births? Miracles with loaves and fishes? Resurrection? Poetic fables only, not to be taken literally? If that's the case, though, what's left but a few well-intentioned homilies and a lot of pompous theatrics? If God did in fact become man, suffer, die, and rise again to save me, then I owe him everything. But if it's just a beautiful story, then I can love my neighbor with or without regular doses of bread and wine. I veer southeast. The truth about the universe, here, is infinitely stranger and infinitely more grand. It lies in the laws of physics that have come to know themselves through humanity. Our destiny and purpose are encoded in the fine structure constant and the value of the density omega. The human race, in whatever form, robot or organic, will keep on advancing for the next 10 billion years until we can give rise to the hyperintelligence which will cause the finely tuned Big Bang required to bring us into existence, if we don't die out in the next few millennia. In which case, other intelligent creatures will perform the task. It doesn't matter who carries the torch. Exactly. None of it matters. Why should I care what a civilization of posthumans, robots, or aliens might or might not do 10 billion years from now? What does any of this grandiose shit have to do with me? I finally catch sight of Maria, a few blocks ahead of me, and right on cue, the existentialist attractor to the west firmly steers me away from the suburbs of the cosmic Baroque. I increase my pace, but only slightly. It's too hot to run, but more to the point, sudden acceleration can have some peculiar side effects, bringing on unexpected philosophical swerves. As I narrow the gap, she turns at the sound of my footsteps. I say, "Hi." "Hi." She doesn't seem exactly thrilled to see me, but then this isn't exactly the place for it. I fall into step beside her. "You left without me." She shrugs. "I wanted to be on my own for a while. I wanted to think things over." I laugh. "If you wanted to think, you should have stayed on the freeway." "There's another spot up ahead. In the park. It's just as good." She's right, although now I'm here to spoil it for her. I ask myself for the thousandth time, why do I want us to stay together? Because of what we have in common? But we owe most of that to the very fact that we are together, traveling the same paths, corrupting each other with our proximity. Because of our differences, then? For the sake of occasional moments of mutual incomprehensibility? But the longer we're together, the more that vestige of mystery will be eroded. Orbiting each other can only lead to spiraling together, an end to all distinctions. Why then? The honest answer, here and now, is food and sex. Although tomorrow, elsewhere, no doubt I'll look back and brand that conclusion a cynical lie. I fall silent as we drift toward the equilibrium zone. The last few minutes' confusion still rings in my head, satisfyingly jumbled, the giddy succession of truncated epiphanies effectively canceling each other out, leaving nothing behind but an amorphous sense of distrust. I remember a school of thought from pre-meltdown days which proclaimed, with bovine good intentions, confusing laudable tolerance with sheer credulity, that there was something of value in every human philosophy. And what's more, when you got right down to it, they all really spoke the same universal truths and were all ultimately reconcilable. Apparently, none of these supine ecumenicists have survived to witness the palpable disproof of their hypothesis. I expect they all converted, 3 seconds after meltdown, to the faith of whoever was standing closest to them at the time. Maria mutters angrily, "Wonderful." I look up at her and then follow her gaze. The park has come into view, and if it's time to herself she wanted, she has more than me to contend with. At least 2 dozen other tramps are gathered in the shade. That's rare, but it does happen. Equilibrium zones are the slowest parts of everybody's orbits, so I suppose it's not surprising that occasionally a group of us end up becalmed together. As we come closer, I notice something stranger. Everybody reclining on the grass is facing the same way, watching something, or someone, hidden from view by the trees. Someone. A woman's voice reaches us, the words indistinct at this distance, but the tone mellifluous, confident, gentle, but persuasive. Maria says nervously, "Maybe we should stay back. Maybe the equilibrium's shifted." Maybe. I'm as worried as she is, but intrigued as well. I don't feel much of a tug from any of the familiar local attractors, but then I can't be sure that my curiosity itself isn't a new hook for an old idea. I say, Let's just skirt around the rim of the park. We can't ignore this. We have to find out what's going on. If a nearby basin has expanded and captured the park, then keeping our distance from the speaker is no guarantee of freedom. It's not her words or her lone presence that could harm us. But Maria, knowing all this I'm sure, accepts my strategy for warding off the danger and nods assent. We position ourselves in the middle of the road and at the eastern edge of the park, without noticeable effect. The speaker, middle-aged I'd guess, looks every inch a tramp, from the dirt-stiff clothes to the crudely cut hair to the weathered skin and lean build of a half-starved perennial walker. Only the voice is wrong. She's set up a frame, like an easel, on which she's stretched a large map of the city. The roughly hexagonal cells of the basins are neatly marked in a variety of colors. People used to swap maps like this all the time in the early years. Maybe she's just showing off her prized possession, hoping to trade it for something worthwhile. I don't think much of her chances. By now, I'm sure every tramp relies on his or her own mental picture of the ideological terrain. Then she lifts a pointer and traces part of a feature I'd missed, a delicate web of blue lines weaving through the gaps between the hexagons. The woman says, "But of course it's no accident. We haven't stayed out of the basins all these years by sheer good luck or even skill." She looks out across the crowd, notices us, pauses a moment, then says calmly, "We've been captured by our own attractor. It's nothing like the others. It's not a fixed set of beliefs in a fixed location, but it's still an attractor. It's still drawn us to it from whatever unstable orbits we might have been on. I've mapped it, part of it, and I've sketched it as well as I can. The true detail may be infinitely fine, but even from this crude representation, you should recognize paths you've walked yourselves." I stare at the map. From this distance, the blue strands are impossible to follow individually. I can see that they cover the route that Maria and I have taken over the last few days, but an old man calls out, "You've scrawled a lot of lines between the basins. What does that prove?" "Not between all the basins." She touches a point on the map. "Has anyone ever been here? Or here? Or here? No? Here? Or here? Why not? They're all wide corridors between attractors. They look as safe as any of the others. So why have we never been to these places? For the same reason nobody living in the fixed attractors has. They're not part of our territory. They're not part of our own attractor." I know she's talking nonsense, but the phrase alone is enough to make me feel panicky, claustrophobic. Our own attractor. We've been captured by our own attractor. I scan the rim of the city on the map. The blue line never comes close to it. In fact, the line gets about as far from the center as I've ever traveled myself. Proving what? Only that this woman has had no better luck than I have. If she'd escaped the city, she wouldn't be here to claim that escape was impossible. A woman in the crowd, visibly pregnant, says, "You've drawn your own paths is all. You've stayed out of danger. I've stayed out of danger. We all know what places to avoid. That's all you're telling us. That's all we have in common." "No!" The speaker traces a stretch of the blue line again. "This is who we are. We're not aimless wanderers. We're the people of this strange attractor. We have an identity, a unity, after all." There's laughter and a few desultory insults from the crowd. I whisper to Maria, "Do you know her? Have you seen her before?" "I'm not sure. I don't think so." "You wouldn't have. Isn't it obvious? She's some kind of robot evangelist." "She doesn't talk much like one." "Rationalist. Not Christian or Mormon." "Rationalists don't send evangelists." "No? Mapping strange attractors? If that's not rationalist jargon, what is it?" Maria shrugs. "Basins, attractors, they're all rationalist words, but everybody uses them. You know what they say. The devil has the best tunes, but the rationalists have the best jargon. Words have to come from somewhere." The woman says, "I'll build my church on sand, and I'll ask no one to follow me. And yet you will. You all will." I say, "Let's go." I take Maria's arm, but she pulls free angrily.
"Why are you so against her? Maybe she's right."
"Are you crazy?"
"Everyone else has an attractor. Why can't we have one of our own?"
Stranger than all the rest. Look at it. It's the most beautiful thing on the map. I shake my head, horrified. How can you say that? We've stayed free. We've struggled so hard to stay free. She shrugs. Maybe. Or maybe we've been captured by what you call freedom. Maybe we don't need to struggle anymore. Is that so bad? If we're doing what we want either way, why should we care? Without any fuss, the woman starts packing up her easel, and the crowd of tramps begins to disperse. Nobody seems to have been much affected by the brief sermon. Everybody heads off calmly on their own chosen orbits. I say, the people in the basins are doing what they want. I don't want to be like them. Maria laughs. Believe me, you're not. No, you're right, I'm not. They're rich, fat, and complacent. I'm starving, tired, and confused. And for what? Why am I living this way? That robot's trying to take away the one thing that makes it all worthwhile. Yeah? Well, I'm tired and hungry too. And maybe an attractor of my own will make it all worthwhile. How? I laughed derisively. Will you worship it? Will you pray to it? No, but I won't have to be afraid anymore. If we really have been captured, if the way we live is stable after all, then putting one foot wrong won't matter. We'll be drawn back to our own attractor. We won't have to worry that the smallest mistake will send us sliding into one of the basins. If that's true, aren't you glad? I shake my head angrily. That's bullshit. Dangerous bullshit. Staying out of the basins is a skill. It's a gift. You know that. We navigate the channels carefully, balancing the opposing forces. Do we? I'm sick of feeling like a tightrope walker. Being sick of it doesn't mean it isn't true. Don't you see? She wants us to be complacent. The more of us who start to think orbiting is easy, the more of us will end up captured by the basins. I'm distracted by the sight of the prophet hefting her possessions and setting off. I say, look at her. She may be a perfect imitation, but she's a robot. She's a fake. They've finally understood that their pamphlets and their preaching machines won't work, so they sent a machine to lie to us about our freedom. Maria says, prove it. What? You've got a knife. If she's a robot, go up to her, stop her, cut her open. Prove it. The woman, the robot, crosses the park, heading northwest, away from us. I say, you know me, I could never do that. If she's a robot, she won't feel a thing. But she looks human. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stick a knife into a perfect imitation of human flesh. Because you know that she's not a robot. You know she's telling the truth. Part of me is simply glad to be arguing with Maria for the sake of proving our separateness, but part of me finds everything she's saying too painful to leave unchallenged. I hesitate a moment. Then I put down my pack and sprint across the park toward the prophet. She turns when she hears me and stops walking. There's no one else nearby. I halt a few meters away from her and catch my breath. She regards me with patient curiosity. I stare at her, feeling increasingly foolish. I can't pull a knife on her. She might not be a robot after all. She might just be a tramp with strange ideas. She says,
Did you want to ask me something?
almost without thinking, I blurt out, how do you know nobody's ever left the city? How can you be so sure it's never happened? She shakes her head.
I didn't say that. The attractor looks like a closed loop to me. Anyone who's been captured by it could never leave, but other people may have escaped.
What other people?
People who weren't in the attractor's basin.
I scowl, confused. What basin? I'm not talking about the people of the basins, I'm talking about us.
She laughs. I'm sorry. I don't mean the basins that lead to the fixed attractors. Our strange attractor has a basin too. All the points that lead to it. I don't know what this basin's shape is. Like the attractor itself, the detail could be infinitely fine. Not every point in the gaps between the hexagons would be part of it. Some points must lead to the fixed attractors. That's why some tramps have been captured by them. Other points would belong to the strange attractor's basin. But others... What? Other points might lead to infinity, to escape.
Which points? She shrugs.
Who knows? There could be 2 points side by side, one leading into the strange attractor, one leading, eventually, out of the city.
The only way to find out which is which would be to start at each point and see what happens. But you said we'd all been captured already. She nods. After so many orbits, the basins must have emptied into their respective attractors. The attractors are the stable part. The basins lead into the attractors, but the attractors lead into themselves. Anyone who is destined for a fixed attractor must be in it by now, and anyone who is destined to leave the city has already gone. Those of us who are still in orbit will stay that way. We have to understand that, accept that, learn to live with it. And if that means inventing our own faith, our own religion, I grab her arm, draw my knife, and quickly scrape the point across her forearm. She yelps and pulls free, then clasps her hand to the wound. A moment later, she takes it away to inspect the damage, and I see the thin red line on her arm and a rough, wet copy on her palm.
You lunatic!
She yells, backing away. Maria approaches us. The probably flesh and blood prophet addresses her.
He's mad! Get him off me!
Maria takes hold of my arm, then, inexplicably, leans toward me and puts her tongue in my ear. I burst out laughing. The woman steps back uncertainly, then turns and hurries away. Maria says, "Not much of a dissection, but as far as it went, it was in my favor. I win." I hesitate, then feign surrender. You win. By nightfall, we end up on the freeway again, this time to the east of the city center. We gaze at the sky above the black silhouettes of abandoned office towers, our brains mildly scrambled by the residual effects of a nearby cluster of astrologers, as we eat the day's prize catch, a giant vegetarian pizza. Finally, Maria says, "Venus has set. I think we ought to sleep now." I nod. "I'll wait up for Mars." Traces of the day's barrage drift through my mind, more or less at random, but I can still recall most of what the woman in the park told me. After so many orbits, the basins must have been emptied. So by now, we've all ended up captured. But how could she know that? How could she be sure? And what if she's wrong? What if we haven't all yet arrived in our final resting place? The astrologers say none of her filthy, materialist, reductionist lies can be true, except the ones about destiny. We like destiny. Destiny is fine. I get up and walk a dozen meters south, neutralizing their contribution. Then I turn and watch Maria sleeping. There could be 2 points side by side, one leading into the strange attractor, one leading, eventually, out of the city. The only way to find out which is which would be to start at each point and see what happens. Right now, everything she said sounds to me like some heavily distorted and badly misunderstood rationalist model. And here I am, grasping at hope, seizing on half of her version, and throwing out the rest. Metaphors mutating and hybridizing all over again. I walk over to Maria, crouch down and bend to kiss her, gently, upside down on the forehead. She doesn't even stir. Then I lift my pack and set off down the freeway, believing for a moment that I can feel the emptiness beyond the city reach through, reach over, all the obstacles ahead, and claim me. And that was Unstable Orbits in the Space of Lies by Greg Egan. Ah, how about all that, folks? How about all that? That was the final story in Greg Egan's Axiomatic, Short Stories of Science Fiction. Highly recommend him and his other works. Very, very fond. Um, a bit heady, a bit mathy. But that's never hurt anyone before. So yeah, next week I'll be going back to pulps, some nice good old pulpy stuff, because I've got quite a collection of that I've been meaning to get through. And other than that, this coming Monday I have my Mecha Mondays stream where I'll do something mecha related.
And then Wednesday, I have my Warframe Wednesday stream where I do Warframey things. And this time they should have the new Corpus Gas City tile set up and running with all the new content that entails, including whatever the new event is. So, unlike this past week where they were like, "Oh no, we got to put a hold on that. Got to put the brakes on that. Won't be out till next week." So, there's that. Other than that, thanks for tuning in. If you tuned in, if you didn't tune in, you should. I will keep doing these. Have a good one, uh, and see you later. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.